Okay, so we're going to get started. Welcome everybody to today's webinar as part of our 0 Degrees of Separation series brought to you by McSilver Institute NYU Silver School of Social Work and our managed care as well as our community technical assistance centers. My name is Lydia Franco and I would like to welcome you to the second offering of our 3-part series on collective impact. Today's webinar is focused on measurement and sustainability, and we have some wonderful presenters from Strive who will kind of walk you through some of those concepts. The role of social determinants is a multi-platform online series intended to help clinical professionals, policymakers, and all who influence our healthcare system to think critically about social factors and their direct and indirect effects on individuals' health and mental health. Before I introduce our presenters, I just want to do some a brief orientation to our webinar system, especially if it's the first time you've logged on. So currently everybody is muted. If you would like to communicate with us, please use the chat box. If you look on your screen, there should be a chat box at the bottom right. If for some reason you don't see that chat box, there's a little chat icon at the top right. You can click that and that should open up your chat box. When you send a question or a comment, make sure that you use that drop-down and send to all panelists before you submit. That way all the panelists can see your question or comment. If you're having any technical issues, please use that chat box and make sure to chat to our host. And our host is Brianna, or it'll also say host, whichever one you can choose. The message will get to her, and she'll try to troubleshoot whatever technical issue you may have. We highly encourage you to submit comments and questions all throughout the webinar. We will hold some time at the end for a Q&A period, so our presenter may attend to your question during the webinar or may just wait till the end and answer those questions then. At the end of our webinar, we'll also have a feedback survey that pops up as you close out of the webinar, so we highly encourage you to complete that feedback survey as we do look at those for additional topics or improvement on our webinar system. Additionally, I just want to let everybody know now, and we'll remind folks as we go on, that the recording for this webinar as well as the slides will be posted on our ctacny.org website, and we'll post that in the chat box and make sure to remind folks of that as we go through the webinar. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to be joined by Colleen Molesky, Senior Manager of Continuous Improvement, and Heidi Black, who serves as the Senior Manager of Innovation at Strive Together. Colleen and Heidi, thanks so much for joining us. Maybe we can get started by hearing a little bit more about you and then kind of going into the presentation.
That sounds great, Lydia. Thanks so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We're looking forward to sharing more about our work and also a few tools that you may be able to use to take back into your individual organizations or to get involved in a local collective impact partnership if there is one in your area. So to give you a little bit of an introduction, my name is Colleen Molesky, and I'm the Senior Manager of Continuous Improvement here at Strive Together. I've joined the organization about a year and a half ago, coming from some former fellowship experience in the education world, as well as some corporate social responsibility, specifically around science and math outreach for aerospace company. So I've been with Strive for about a year and a half now, and work closely with Heidi on, we do a series of capability building, trying to work with local partnerships on improving the tools that they have at their disposal to improve outcomes for students. So I'll turn it over to Heidi to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heidi Black. I'm the Senior Manager for Innovation at Strive Together. I have a background in education. I spent 6 years in the classroom teaching elementary school. I went and worked at the federal policy level, did education policy in Capitol Hill before coming to Strive Together. And I've been here for about 4.5 years and work closely, like Colleen said, with Colleen and other members of our staff to work with our 72 communities across the country to improve outcomes for kids.
So I think to get started, it might be fruitful to introduce you to the Strive Together network and a little bit of our principles to introduce you to the way that we approach collective impact. So the Strive Together community is made up of 72 different partnerships across 32 states. We started in 2007 as a local effort here in Cincinnati, Ohio, and in 2011 was when the Strive Together Network launched. There was a lot of interest from other communities and in the initial success that Cincinnati was seeing. This is also the year that the Stanford Social Innovation Review wrote a piece about the 5 conditions of collective impact that I think that Zone 126, if you were on the last webinar, introduced you to. And so there was growing interest in this term called collective impact and how we can really learn from other communities and do this more effectively together. In 2014, then, we had about 100 partnerships across the U.S., and in 2014 is when collective impact started to become very buzzwordy. And there was an effort across the network to develop what we called the theory of action. And the idea was to set some basic principles, to expand upon those 5 initial conditions that were written about, and then also to have a roadmap of how do you progress, how do you build a collective impact partnership, and how do you also ensure quality? How do you ensure that there are rigorous actions being taken to really improve outcomes for kids? And so the theory of action here is, you can see an example of, this is an abbreviated version, you can see the full version on our website, but it's really built on 4 pillars: shared community vision, evidence-based decision-making, collaborative action, and investment and sustainability. We'll do a lot of focus today on Pillar 2, evidence-based decision-making, where we'll talk about measurement and how communities are measuring the work that they're doing, what outcomes they're using, and also Pillar 4, in terms of sustainability. How do you ensure that this work is sustainable in the long run? But the basic principle of the theory of action is that you have these benchmarks. You first determine some of those initial things, like what is your geographic scope? Are you going to be a city or a community-wide partnership? And progress from there into more advanced kinds of working together so that you're actually changing systems that result in better outcomes for students. And throughout the theory of action, it's founded upon 4 key principles that are to eliminate disparities. There are severe gaps between student populations, and how do we work together to eliminate those, leveraging existing assets, acknowledging that there are already a lot of resources and a lot of individuals that care, organizations that care about improving education. How do we bring together the existing assets that we have in order to use them more effectively to improve those outcomes? Building a culture of continuous improvement, thinking about using data, and not just quantitative data, but also qualitative data, in a way that you are improving. You are acknowledging what the current state is, but testing and making changes to improve, rather than using data as a hammer or to evaluate and to shame, to say you're not doing things correctly. How do you build a culture where organizations are willing and want to share their data so that they can work together to improve those outcomes? And then finally, engaging community expertise and voice, acknowledging that those people that are most affected are often ones that can tell you not only what the problem is, but often can come up with solutions. So how do we engage community members and also some of those unusual suspects, not just the traditional education organizations, in making this a community-wide effort? And we'll talk to you a little bit about some tools that we use to do that here later in this slide deck. So ultimately, the goal of the theory of action and really of our model is to move from collaboration to collective impact. And collaboration is probably what many of you may be used to. You sign up for a committee, people show up to a meeting, and you're all coming with your own agenda, and ultimately, there's a lot of talk that happens, but maybe not a lot of action. And so this model is a way for us to say, let's make this into the way that we do business, that no single individual or organization can hero through and can improve outcomes for kids alone. And so how do we make this as a part of the way that systems work in our community so we are better supporting students? To give you a little bit of a first taste in terms of what outcomes or what are the measures that we use, there are 6 cradle-to-career outcomes that, as an entire network, we are invested in. And that's starting with kindergarten readiness, making sure that students are coming to school prepared, early grade reading, so are they able to read by 3rd grade, middle grade math, high school graduation, college enrollment, and college completion or degree attainment. And these are really the points in the life cycle and supported by research, items that are indicators that are important in order to be successful ultimately later in your career. These are all, I should say that these are all things that are set locally though by local needs and context in terms of what priorities do they have, what measures do they want to pick. Other communities do work on additional outcomes such as opportunity youth or career attainment. But this slide here shows some examples of what some indicators can be. So, you know, for example, in early grade reading or middle grade math, they may use as a ultimate indicator the state assessment that the state has established. But there also are many contributing indicators that the partnerships are using to assess the progress against those. So, for example, for 3rd grade reading, often communities find that the students who are chronically absent may be at risk of not being proficient at 3rd grade reading. So throughout the year, before those state assessments happen, they may monitor those who are chronically absent in a way to intervene and support those students to attend school, get the instruction they need to ultimately be proficient. So where there are not state assessments, for example, kindergarten readiness is one that is often set locally. So some states do have kindergarten assessments, such as Washington State has the Washington WaKids is what they use, which I'll share in a moment. Other communities, for example, North Country Thrive in northern New York, there was not a state assessment in New York, and so those partnerships across those 3 counties, the school districts came together and said, we really need to set and establish and pick a kindergarten readiness assessment. And so they identified one that would work for each of their partnerships to use in order to measure the work that they were doing over time. So this is an example of a report card. The report card is actually part of Pillar 1, Shared Community Vision. And so we ask that partnerships publish a community report card, both to show kind of what indicators they're measuring, but also the current state and the progress that they're making against it. So this is an example from South Seattle. It's a partnership called the Roadmap Project. And this is an example of contributing indicators that they're measuring, so the percent of low-income children that are enrolled in early learning programs. And ultimately, then the ultimate indicator that they are using is the WaKids assessment that measures 6 domains of kindergarten readiness: literacy, physical, social emotional, cognitive, language, and math. And so this is a tool that is used to both rally the community around these measures, but also to inform various stakeholders about the progress that's being made in the community. Another example of a report card is here with the Roadmap Project. So they're also measuring social emotional learning, and one of the interventions that they ran was a series of success coaches that were working with the students who were most at risk of not graduating. And the way that they measured progress against that is that they were using the Gear Up Student Motivational Survey. And these are some examples of assessments, questions that they used, and the pre and post assessment that they used of working with those success coaches in order to see if the intervention that they were running was having an impact ultimately on the motivation of the students in order to the efficacy that they felt around graduating and being able to participate in college after they graduated from high school. So I'll turn it over to Heidi to talk a little bit about how we test change and to start with some examples of tools that we use in order to measure the work we're doing.
Thanks, Colleen. So Colleen kind of gave you a very high-level overview of our approach, and at the highest levels, how we look at measurement and track progress on outcomes. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we test change, and so taking you from a very high level to kind of the ground level of how do we start to do this work, and how do we build and measure these things, and then to ensure sustainability. And so we use an approach called Plan, Do, Study, Act. It's a very well-known continuous improvement approach. It's based around the scientific method. And so if you remember back to middle school or high school math when you were studying that, it's really kind of asking that question that's usually around a problem that you're experiencing and developing a hypothesis. That's the plan section. You then conduct the experiment. You're trying to figure out, okay, if this is the problem, I think we can fix it by doing X. That's the do section of trying it and recording what you're doing. Then evaluating what was the result of the work that I did. Did it work? Did it not? What's the data that I need to collect? That's the study section. And then last, either reporting on the conclusion and understanding what you've learned is the act section. And you'll notice that this is cyclical. It continues because based on what you've learned, you can then go through a second cycle of plan, do, study, act based on what you've learned and make continuous improvement. At Strive Together, we have a defined kind of continuous improvement process, and you can see those 8 steps on the screen in front of you. This is, again, it's all based around the plan, do, study, act cycle. We find this is a very simple and effective way for our partnerships to attack this. Our continuous improvement process, because we're trying to do this across organizations and across the community, is very collaborative. We tend to pull in continuous improvement tools, design thinking tools and approaches. We use something called results-based leadership, which is out of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and that just helps with accountability and the challenges that you encounter when you're working across organizations. And as well as we have a deep focus on equity and eliminating disparities, and that's kind of all designed into our continuous improvement process. So wanted to share just a quick, just wanted to level you quickly on what we mean by continuous improvement. Oftentimes in education, data is used for reporting and accountability or evaluation. In continuous improvement, data and information is used to learn and to improve on what you're currently doing. And so this is a big shift in education, a big shift for many of our partners because they're used to data being used in a very punitive way, and we're shifting that from really using it as a place of learning and improving and using it as kind of here's where we are and here's our baseline. What are the steps we need to take to improve that? So how do we use all of these things to see an improvement at the ground level for kids? I'm going to share an example with you. So this is just a recap of the slide that we showed earlier. These are our 6 outcomes. Indicators are the key focus, but if you look down at the bottom, there's a yellow box around an orange box that has some contributing indicators. And this is typically where, when we start with communities who are trying to make an impact, is working with them to build on those, to identify those contributing indicators and then work to impact them. So in this example that I'm going to share with you, which is around early grade reading, that's typically 3rd grade reading proficiency. In this community, a couple of contributing indicators they felt that directly impacted reading proficiency was the % of children who are chronically absent and the % of children who were proficient in 2nd grade. And the example I'm about to share with you is around chronic absence. So in our community in Salt Lake City, there's our organization is called Promise Partnerships, and they are working to improve chronic absence because they found a correlation between chronic absence in grades K to 3 and 3rd grade reading proficiency rates. And they were working with a group of folks who were based at a school, and they knew they had a chronic absence issue. They felt very strongly it was a transportation issue because of the information they had collected. They were in an elementary school that did not have any busing. And so kids and parents were responsible for getting themselves to school. the principal had heard about this amazing thing called walking school buses, which is kind of coordinated walking to school groups, and really wanted to implement that. And so what they did is they started to think through, is walking school buses something that we need to do, or are they experiencing another transportation issue? So the first thing that they did was to process map and to figure out how do students get to school. And so the images you see on the screen in front of you are that initial process map, starting from when they got home at the end of the school day to getting to school the next day. And they worked through that and they process mapped that out. They realized that many kids take different steps. And so after process mapping it, they were also trying to understand more deeply how these kids got to school, and they ended up actually using a geomap and tracking kids who were chronically absent on a map to see if there was any kind of correlation between where they lived and where they went to school. And they actually found two groups of students that were clustered. One was in an apartment complex kind of on the edge of the school district boundary, on the school boundaries. And those kids, they learned, were dependent on parents getting them to school. And they also found a cluster of kids who lived in an apartment complex right behind the school who were also chronically absent. And so what they did next was to work with those two different groups of students, and again, to kind of process map that. You'll put the next slide. And so just very quickly, a process map is just a really easy way to identify the steps that someone is following to complete a process, in this case, in getting to school. And this allows people to understand what's really happening in a community and where could we start to make an impact. So in Salt Lake, they did these actually with those two clusters of kids who were experiencing higher rates of chronic absence in these two apartment communities to better understand what the challenges were. So they went from a very high-level process map, which they developed before they worked with the kids, to what you see on here, which is a micro-level map. So really going down to map out what was the process for kids in the further away apartment complex, and what was the process map for the kids who literally lived behind the school. What they found out, I will tell you, is that the kids who lived further away were dependent on their parents for driving them to school. And so in that case, their idea of walking school buses wasn't going to work because they weren't walking to school. And so they are currently working with parents in that apartment complex to see how to better get their kids to school, and they'll be implementing those interventions in the next school year. And then they're currently process mapping with the chronically absent kids behind the apartment complex, in the apartment complex behind the school, to see what the impacts are. Is it a transportation issue? Is it a health issue? Is it some other thing? And they'll make a change on that. But we find process mapping just to be really a very helpful resource in trying to initially identify the problem and see what other ways that you need to kind of use measurement tactics to understand what's happening. Another tool that we used with this group to help understand is something called a 5 why analysis. This is a traditional continuous improvement tool, and it's literally, the concept is oftentimes if you start with a problem and ask yourself, why is this happening, usually by the 5th time you can get to the root cause. And so that's helping to identify what are the true root causes. At Strive Together, when we think about measurement, we believe very strongly in using both qualitative and quantitative measures. What we find is that numerical data points often are a great kind of initial shedding light on where to focus, but you really need to go and talk and engage with community members, with those kids, with those parents, with those direct service providers to get the additional data points to really truly understand why. So they had the data that said these kids are chronically absent, but they had to dig deeper by engaging with those children, those families, those direct service providers to find out why. A 5 Why tool will do the same thing and help you get down to the root cause of that. And it's just an incredibly simple yet very useful tool in understanding what the problem is, thinking through measurement, and really getting to the root cause of it so that you can sustain the work. Finding the root cause is essentially pulling a weed out by its roots as opposed to playing weed killer, so that you can really impact the problem where it's starting and not just the symptoms.
Thanks, Heidi. And the next example that I'm going to share is around another problem that we often have in trying to solve complex social issues. One is that we often jump straight to strategies or don't understand the root cause. And another, I think, is that we only engage the usual suspects. We don't go away from the, we don't reach out and involve others that may be able to help impact the issue. And so this example is looking at the percent of students who in a community that were completing the FAFSA, the Federal Student Aid Form, as a contributing indicator to financial readiness in order to enroll in college. And so the community that we're focused on here is actually a community in Portland, Oregon, a specific high school, Franklin High School, that was part of our Impact and Improvement Network learning group that was using these tools in order to improve FAFSA completion. And this is a tool that we use called a run chart to measure progress over time. And you can see as they were tracking the work that they were doing, you can see that they had very successful, between 2014 and 2015 into the 2016 school year, a very successful spike in student FAFSA completions. And the nice thing about a run chart, when you annotate it, is you're able to figure out the reason why. And the reason why they saw this increase in student FAFSA completion is because they tested a new intervention that engaged some folks that they hadn't previously. Often it fell on the guidance counselor who was part of the school, and sometimes they engaged some external college access organizations, but they were finding that those, just having all of the burden be on those individuals was not getting them to the increase in FAFSA completions that they needed to increase the number of students that were able to afford and therefore enroll in school. And so they had an idea of meeting students where they are. And so they realized that all of their seniors were either in an economics or a social studies class, and they involved those teachers in the FAFSA completion process. So they worked with those teachers to incorporate FAFSA information into their traditional coursework. And so each one of those students was exposed to and had time to complete the FAFSA during their social studies or their economics course. So I think that something a tool that we often use in identifying who those other suspects, unusual suspects may be, is called the Results at the Center chart. And that is a results-based leadership tool from the Annie A. Casey Foundation that Heidi mentioned earlier. And it's thinking about what you ultimately want to achieve. So you put your outcome, increasing FAFSA or reducing chronic absence or improving social and emotional well-being in the center, and think about the various sectors and individuals or organizations that you can involve in order to impact. So we see examples of this across our partnerships. For example, in Memphis, they were looking at increasing the third grade reading, and one contributing indicator that they had for that was actually just the access that the students had to books. And so they started taking the books, rather than saying you can come get the books here from the library, they started taking the books out to where the students were, and some of the community barbershops, that was, or some of the community churches, places that these students already happen to be. Another example is often partnerships with healthcare. So in thinking about kindergarten readiness and ensuring that the children from the earliest age are getting access to books. Many of our partnerships, such as here in Cincinnati or in Albany, New York, they actually partner with the healthcare providers for the well baby exams, because those are points in time where the parents are already coming in, and so they have partnered up with pediatricians to ensure that they are having access to books, getting well, managed plans if they are being identified for early interventions. So this is another tool, and both of these tools, I should say, regardless of what organization you're working in, regardless of your sector, these are tools that our partnerships are using, our organizations are using, in order to really identify what are the root causes of the problem, so not jumping straight to the strategies, but really thinking about engaging those community voices deeply, understanding the problems deeply and what needs to be fixed. And then this is another tool to think about who are the partners that we can involve in order to fix those root causes, who are already doing work. How can we more efficiently connect communities and individuals to services that they need in order to fix those root causes? So I think it's something that is really applicable regardless of what service or organization you're in. So the second piece, and we've talked a lot about measuring the work and testing and how are we measuring improvements, and the second part of this webinar is really around sustaining the work. And that's always a question, particularly in the nonprofit sector, is how are you going to keep this work going? And I think that's something that we believe strongly in the Strive Together Network, is that the way that you sustain the work is really proving that it works. And so this is something that is important for community buy-in, not just for investors. Obviously, you have to sustain the investment in the work, but more importantly, the investment of the individuals who are coming and working together and changing the way that they're doing their day-to-day practice, the community buy-in that is necessary to sustain the work as well. So we have an example here actually from Tacoma, Washington. And 10 years ago, this was the headline of USA Today. It was talking about 1 in 10 schools across the U.S. are quote-unquote dropout factories, and Tacoma was listed as one of the communities that was a quote-unquote dropout factory, where the majority of students were not making it to graduation. And this really spurred the community to action. So they formed the Graduate Tacoma Partnership and worked using a variety of strategies, using the theory of action, using continuous improvement to improve the ultimate outcomes that they had. And the success that they saw ultimately resulted in last year a timepiece on the turnaround that happened in that community. So Arnie Duncan mentioned that in Tacoma, Washington, higher expectations and renewed focus on students' needs helped public schools leap off the dropout factory list and onto the honor roll, and are as some of the highest performing schools in the state. And so as we're thinking about sustainability of the work, our goal here is to really ensure that we're using data, that we are making those improvements, and that the community is seeing those improvements and is continued to buy in and to want to be involved, to want to invest not only resources but also their time in working together to make a larger impact for students. So I'll leave you today with, we'll open it up to questions in a few minutes, but I'll leave you today with an opportunity to get involved. Obviously, you can take the tools that we introduced today back to your organizations, but another thing to think about of a way to get involved is actually finding your local partnerships. We are in 72 communities across the U.S. And so you can visit our website, strivetogether.org/the-network, and enter your location and see if there is a partnership near you. And offering, and I've seen where you fit on that results at the center chart. Even if you are not directly related from an education perspective, there are likely touch points where you and your organization could impact and help improve the way that the partnerships are working and approaching solving these issues for students. So I think with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Lydia. I'm not sure if questions have come in, but we do have, it looks like about 20 minutes if there are any questions from the participants.
Great, thank you so much. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that, you know, collective impact generally is a framework, and we did this in the first webinar, is really a cross-sector, cross-system collaboration framework to attend to social problems, whether on a small scale, maybe specifically, you know, to a certain issue to a certain school or district, or sort of larger complex social problems as well. And what I really appreciate about your approach is that you really take a targeted kind of structured, you add sort of a structured framework that really kind of focuses on utilizing data and being very thoughtful around sort of identifying the problem, being very thoughtful around sort of potential solutions, and that you incorporate that continuous kind of quality improvement approach, that it doesn't work one way, how can we tweak it, how can we kind of redo it, and that's also that plan, do, study, check, act approach as well. So I really think that instead of, you know, sometimes you think of collaboration as messy, you know, but I appreciate that you have very much a focus on making it a little bit more structured, leading to more positive outcomes ideally. And has that been your experience, that really by utilizing this more kind of focused approach in a collective impact framework, that it has been much more helpful and helped sort of collaborations to really reach the goals that they were hoping to achieve?
Absolutely. So I think that I think collaboration is always messy, and I think our partnerships would say that there are always what we call adaptive challenges, things that don't necessarily have solutions, and there's politics and complex local issues. But I think that the structure that we use and the kind of various approaches that we use, such as results-based leadership or continuous quality improvement, is really about putting the student at the center. So, you know, often we come into collaborative action network meetings, and when you have the data on the wall, it really focuses you on, you know, this is what we're here to solve, and you know, the adults in the room should be honing in on those students, and not just the numbers and data points that are on the wall, but the really the faces of the students, and those that you've gone out and said, you know, engaged deeply in understanding what their problems were. And so I think that it's you know, it's something that we are constantly figuring out. We're constantly adapting and working with those 72 communities who are really the experts in terms of what's happening on the ground, and so they actually were the ones that established that initial theory of action, and those they're also the ones that continuously help us adapt it as we learn and as we go through this space. But it is something that this kind of rigorous approach is really what we use to move from talking about the things that we need to do differently, or talking about the things that that should change. You know, there's a comic out there that says, who wants change, and everyone has their hands up, and the second question is, who wants to change, and everyone has their heads down, and so it's an approach to really move from, let's talk about the things that need to change in order to improve outcomes for students, to actually doing that, and to doing that together in a way that's not just, I brought my own agenda into the room and I want to keep doing that, but in a way that says, how do we really invest our time and connect students to the resources and organizations that they need that will ultimately result in improved outcomes?
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think in our first webinar of the series, Zone 126 spent some time really talking about challenges in maintaining communication across the partners or among the partners, and do you think then that this, it sounds like that this more kind of structured approach has helped to kind of manage some of those issues, is that right?
Yeah, I would think that because we've been able to work in a more structured manner and pull together the lessons learned of the 72 communities that we work with, that our partners are seeing more of an impact and are able to work through the problems that they face a little bit more effectively, remove those challenges and barriers more quickly because of mainly because there's 72 communities attacking this problem, sharing those challenges, and then utilizing the best practices that we've been able to identify.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we do have a couple of questions kind of coming in. And let me see if I can look at a couple of these and send some your way. So one would be, what did you do after you reviewed the mapping information and found out that the scope of work was not working? the toolkit that was used, either it was PDSA, process mapping, or the 5 Whys, if the data was bad, how did you respond to it? It's easy when everything is good, but what happens when the data is saying that it's not working?
Yeah, so what we always work with partnerships is if something didn't work, find out why. And if you think about the PDSA cycle, that's really the study section. So one example I will share with you is we had a community doing FAFSA night, or they were working on college enrollment, and they were working on financial readiness, but particularly around FAFSA work, similar to the slides that Colleen showed you. And one of their strategies for the way to get more kids to complete the FAFSA was to hold FAFSA completion events. And they had very low numbers attend the first completion event. And so their data, based on that, their data told them it wasn't working. So what most people's gut instinct to do is to just conclude, well, that completion events aren't the right thing. We need to abandon that and try something else. But instead of doing that, they asked themselves, well, why? And so they went back and they had targeted a group of students and their families to attend this event. And so they went back and they talked to the people who had been invited to attend and didn't attend. And it turned out that it was a bad time for these families to do it. They had other activities. It was a bad night. The location was hard to get to. And so with that by collecting that extra data point and finding out why, they were able to readjust. And it was no longer that FAFSA completion events are bad. It was, we need to be more thoughtful about when we're hosting the event and where we're hosting the event. They were able to make that change, and they saw a significant increase in attending the FAFSA completion events and therefore in FAFSA completion. And so one thing that we always talk with our communities about when they get data that says something's not working is find out why. Sometimes it's that it's just a little adjustment that you need to make in order to make it successful. Very rarely is it that the intervention is bad and needs to be completely abandoned. And so just that little tweak and change is usually all you need to do.
Yeah, and I think that's...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. To build on that, as you think about what that community could do is if they've identified that there's it wasn't successful, and so if you go through and actually make the process map, the more micro, that slide that went from macro to micro, the more micro you are in understanding the steps of your process. So step 1, the students have to get to the FAFSA completion night. Step 2, they have to remember to bring their FSA ID. The more micro that you get is you are able to identify failures much better at that kind of more micro level in order to then identify solutions. How do we make sure that they come with their FSA ID and their all of the information and documentation that they need? Well, maybe we will send out a checklist in advance so that their parents know that they need to come with that. And so that's kind of the next step that you can take with the process map is, and it's called, we use a tool called the Simple Failure Mode Effect Analysis, and essentially it's a very simple process map, step 1, step 2, step 3, and you identify in each of those steps what potential failures there could be, and then ultimately what the solutions are for those if you identify that, if you've talked to the parents, if you've sent out a survey and identified that that was a problem.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just want to highlight a couple comments that come in. One person wrote in saying, I really like the results-based leadership aspects of these processes. That approach has really helped us in our JDAI work with our Juvenile Justice Collaborative. One of our subcommittees is working towards reducing school truancies, and your work will really help us. So I wanted to kind of send that your way.
Great. Thank you. Great to hear.
And a couple comments just sort of really reiterating some of the things you already said, that without collaboration, even well-designed reforms are likely to flounder or be subverted. A formal structure within which to undertake joint planning and policy making is essential. And I also have another kind of question. I think this is more for our CTAC side is, did our MCTAC or Managed Care Technical Assistance Center have a place in developing some of these program eval mappings? And I just wanted to clarify that these are resources provided by Strive Together that they're sharing with us that may be helpful for you and some of your behavioral health programs to think about utilizing as well. And I have a couple other questions, and I know for some of these you had talked about sort of building community buy-in both within community and across relationships, and do you have any recommendations for that? That probably is a really, difficult part of really kind of picking these projects up. Do you have any suggestions for those?
Yeah, so first off, I would just say that we found results-based leadership tools and techniques to be a game changer for our communities. We've been working with the Annie Casey Foundation now really closely for about 3 years to do this, and it's been unbelievable in just helping our partners navigate the challenges that you encounter when you're doing work collaboratively, when you're trying to get everybody to work on the problem. And so I find in the SOSR sector, where we're trying to really solve those big, hairy problems that are oftentimes need multiple organizations support and help on, results-based leadership has really been really key to just navigating really large challenges, as well as data use. When it comes to engaging the community, we started to really pull in a lot of design thinking tools and techniques. You guys may know it as human-centered design, but what we've always believed in is you need to engage the community, and by that we mean you need to engage the children and the families and the direct service providers who are working directly with those kids. And that's something we've always believed in, but what we found is that everybody wants to engage those folks, but no one really knows how to do it in a very authentic manner, in a manner that really helps them become a part of the solution and solving the problem. And design thinking tools and techniques allow us to do that. And again, it's very simple tools and strategies. So building off the process map that we just talked through, they have a tool that starts with a process map, but then you walk through the process map with a student or with a parent. And at each step in the process, you talk to that person and find out, what are you thinking right now? How are you feeling? You look around and see kind of what is the environment that they're in, and how is that potentially impacting them. And that's a great way to kind of engage that community and get them to hear about what's going on, and to make improvements from there. And so that's just been really powerful, and I would encourage anybody on the phone who's trying to think through how do we kind of really authentically engage the families, the children, and the folks that you work with every day, is to look at some of those tools and techniques that you can find there. They have a lot of great ways to engage with folks that we've found just to be really incredibly powerful in helping identify what's really going on and what are the solutions that need to be made. Colleen, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I might give a specific example that came to mind while you were talking, and it's around kind of community buy-in, but also specific organizational buy-in in terms of this is an example also from Albany, New York, and they had found that there was a severe drop-off between those who had enrolled in post-secondary and who actually went on the very first day. So it's a problem often called summer slide, and so students will enroll, but ultimately, due to a variety of factors or problems that arise between the time that they enroll and the day that the semester starts, they don't ultimately end up attending the post-secondary institution. And so this was something that they realized that people may not know is even a problem. You know, the high schools say, great, congratulations, they hand their diploma, and think that they're heading off to the school that they enrolled in. And so there was a, they found the data, they found that this was a problem, they went back and explained that this was a problem, and really that was the first time that they had realized that that was something that was happening with their students. And it really sparked, similar to the Graduate Tacoma example where you say, oh no, this can't be happening in our community. It really sparked that I need to be involved and I need to help. And they started a pilot program within one of their schools to try to reduce that, the summer, quote-unquote, summer slide. And so I think that this example really speaks to the larger idea of how do you get the community to buy in, which is, one, are they aware of the problem, and two, then do they, are they riled up about it? Do they want to help, and do they understand how that they can contribute and how they can actually make a difference in it? So I think it's a kind of a couple-step process. There are all of the tools that Heidi mentioned from a design thinking perspective of how do you make sure that you're actually getting out, and I think that that's one of the things that, community engagement doesn't happen within your office. It happens when you go out and you talk to the various stakeholders, whether that's frontline staff, whether that's the community, the families and parents and students themselves, but the organizations that you need to be engaging or should be engaging. Another example, I think, is thinking about the non-usual suspects that we actually have a team in one of our leadership programs, and they brought someone from the Housing Authority as one of their team members for improving third grade reading. And he said, you really need to think about who are the people in the communities that are already trying to improve this and that are there where the students are. And so, sometimes I think it's just making the ask and saying, hey, this is a problem, and here's where we think that you can fit in. And that's one way of thinking about community buy-in or community engagement.
Yeah, and I just kind of piggybacking on with something that you had just said, I was interested in hearing sort of any collaborations, not just within education, but with other sectors. So have you had collaborations with mental health or behavioral health systems or organizations? Have you had collaborations with, I think you just said housing, can you talk a little bit about, outside of education and sort of cross-system collaboration and what that has looked like? I think our audience kind of spans a variety of different sort of folks in the sort of helping professions. We definitely have a lot of representation in behavioral health as well. So can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences with those types of collaborations?
Yeah, so I can give you an example from one of our communities. One of our communities was working on improving high school graduation, and they were using mentoring as a strategy. And they identified that fewer African-American, Black, or Hispanic Latino males were graduating from high school than their peers. And what they realized was when they looked at mentoring, their mentoring organizations and programs had a mismatch. They were actually mentoring more girls than they were boys, and I think it was majority white girls. And so they had a need for mentors that resembled the population that these, African-American, Black, and Latino males that they were trying to help. And so they ended up looping in their business community and putting out an all-call to the business community and looking for mentors. They accessed this just through the structure of the partnership. We have something called a leadership table, which is similar to a board of directors but acts slightly differently. But they put out an all-call into the business community and were able to engage businesses that were already looking for volunteer opportunities for their employees and could kind of build up the mentoring base that they needed. And as a result, through engaging the business community in the work, they were actually able to increase the number of mentors they needed, and they started to see a bump in graduation rates as well.
And the healthcare community is involved in many of our partnerships. Here in Cincinnati, for example, there's a close partnership with Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and so much so in that has kind of evolved over time in some ways that they have been, it started kind of with them training around the PDSA model, so they had a very robust quality improvement division, and so they started, their initial involvement was let's help train education professionals in a very similar model, and it ultimately evolved to where they have included third grade reading as one of their community health metrics, and so they are holding themselves accountable to whether or not children here in Cincinnati are able to read by the time they are in 3rd grade. And so they actually lead the Birth to 9 work group. So they are the actual main convener for the various partners that are coming together around 3rd grade reading and in kindergarten readiness. And that's also why there are so many opportunities for engaging those pediatricians, engaging those healthcare providers in improving early development, but then also ultimately preparing them for literacy proficiency. So I think that there are numerous examples across the partnerships, and it's really a locally defined. You know, we suggest that folks think about those non-usual suspects, but it's really locally defined based on what is the local issue. So if it's transportation, getting kids to school, how are you working with the local transit authority? If it's a healthcare issue, you know, so many students are coming with asthma, how are you working with the local healthcare providers to address those root causes that are resulting in lower educational outcomes for students?
Thank you so much, and I think those examples are really helpful to kind of allow folks to kind of wrap their head around the model. And you know, obviously, you know, it's a framework, right? So the collective impact as well as sort of the approach that you've kind of layered on it that's a little bit more structured is really a framework that can be utilized whether in education or somewhere else. Just because it kind of started in this education context doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't apply in other settings, and it definitely allows and you know, it actually is a structure in which you could develop some of those collaborations across systems. And I think you've highlighted a couple really good examples where you kind of need some of those collaborations to really see some impact. So I just want to, I'm mindful of the time. We only have a couple minutes left in our hour. And so I just wanted to take a second to thank you, Heidi and Colleen and the entire Strive Together team for today's webinar. I do want to highlight that we have a part 3 to our collective impact series. It will be on May 30th, and it's called Reforming the New York State Juvenile Justice, Reforming New York State Juvenile Justice System Through Collective Impact. And that's May 30th from 12 to 1. You can go to ctacny.org to get more information and register. And on this slide, we also have a couple other webinars separate from collective impact that we will be holding in May, more sort of clinically focused content. I do want to also remind folks that the slides and the webinar recording for this webinar, as well as for the whole collective impact series and our whole social determinant series, is also available on our website at ctacny.org. Feel free to contact us at ctac.info@nyu.edu if you have any additional questions or feedback, or if you'd like to hear more about this topic or more examples. Please feel free to contact us and let us know some of your feedback, your questions, and your comments. So, you know, thank you everybody for participating. Thank you so much, Strive Together, for helping us produce and present this webinar. And I just want to thank everybody again and wish everybody a wonderful day. Take care all.
Thank you.